the issue. We're about to move into a panel discussion where we'll start talking about solutions. I particularly want to point out Professor Painter's data and the academic underpinnings of this being, in particular, not just a social service crisis, but also maybe the civil rights issue of our day. The idea that if institutional racism is a great source of homelessness, means that at least on a parallel track, we ought to be trying to deal with that institutional racism as we come up with housing options. So I'm going to bring up our panel. Again, we framed the issue. Now we're talking about solutions, and I think we are just about ready for that. So I will start bringing up the panel. First, my good friend and my actual senator where I live, Senator Holly Mitchell. Mayor Robert Garcia, the mayor of the great city of Long Beach. A woman with obviously a lot of rhythm and passion, Supervisor Kathryn Barger. My former colleague and one of the leading voices on this, Mayor Darrell Steinberg. And moderated by Elex, Michaelson, the co-anchor of Fox 11 and host of The Issue Is.
Good way to start. Hi, everybody. I'm Elex Michaelson. Thank you so much for having us. We got a great group here today. We're excited to talk about this. A group of dedicated, smart policymakers. They all have that in common. All of us have one thing in common, which is we all like to talk. And so our time's actually been cut a little bit because the program is short, so let's try to be as to the point as we possibly can in this discussion today. Although we have got about 35 minutes, which in TV time is an eternity, and we have no commercial breaks. So this is great. This is exciting. This is a huge crisis, as everybody has said. It's the number one issue for so many voters out there. It's the number one issue that we hear about in the news business. It's the number one topic on our show, The Issue Is. And the question I think that most people have is, how did this happen? Why is this happening? And what's the biggest challenge for fixing it? So I guess let's start with that. And Senator Mitchell, I know you've got a time issue, so let's start with you.
Actually, I'm fine. I'm in a room with mayors and governors. I'm not trying to act like I have someplace else to be, so I'll be here with you the whole time.
All right.
I appreciate the question. And, I appreciate Professor Painter for outlining some of the policy issues that got us here around restrictions on construction. But I think it's important for a room as dynamic as this that we have a frank, honest conversation. This didn't happen overnight. I would consider this a slow boil. And every level of government and every past administration has taken their turn at turning up the heat. Policies around eliminating CalWorks, reducing CalWorks from 5 years to 2 years, policies that didn't support foster care kids, any policy that exasperated poverty in the state of California has helped lead us to where we are today. And as policymakers, we have a responsibility to plan, predict, and prevent. And we have to do a better job, regardless of what the polls say, over the long term of understanding decisions we make every day have a long-term, sometimes perhaps unintended consequences. But if we are leaving people in poverty, and in fact passing policies that exacerbate the number of people who are falling deeper into poverty, then we helped to create the human condition we all experience today.
So I'm just as a follow-up to that, you're in charge of the budget at the state level. There are Democratic supermajorities in both houses. You got a Democratic governor. Have the Democratic policies not been working?
As I said, every past administration at every level of government has taken their turn to turn up the heat. Yeah. We all have. And so now that the state is experiencing an economic recovery, we're trying to do all we can to reinstate life-sustaining programs to help people. We passed through the budget last year the first increase in the CalWorks payment in 2 generations. We are trying to undo some of the past bad things that have been done to try to help. But at this point, we already have tens of thousands of people on the street. So I guess my point is, even when voters no longer have homelessness at the top of their mind in these polls, policymakers have to understand that these kinds of crises don't happen overnight. And so it's long-term sustained investments in keeping the bottom from falling out of families' lives is what we have to be committed to.
Mayor Garcia, you see this from a different perspective as the mayor of one of the biggest cities in California. To that question, people think a lot of money's been poured at this, and yet the problem's getting worse. Why isn't the problem getting better, and what do you see as the biggest challenge?
Well, I agree that income inequality is the biggest challenge we have as a state, but overall, the bigger issue is also just a production issue, and the state has lagged so dramatically in housing production. And so it's not just a matter of, I think, services and income inequality and poverty, but it really comes down to we have just not built enough housing, and the demand is so high that you have that market push on rents going up higher, less inventory out across the state of California, and more people competing for the same exact apartment, where years ago you might have 15, 20 people applying for one apartment. Today it's 100 or 150. And all of that causes a huge impact on cities. We cannot build housing fast enough. I think that the state is looking around the edges, focusing on production, but I think that there has to be an emergency level push at the state level to really allow both the public and private sector to build more quickly. And in some ways, and I know Mayor Garcetti and I talk about this, and Mayor Steinberg as well, but this whole issue that was brought up earlier about NIMBYism is alive and well in every city up and down the state of California. And the voices that are against production are the loudest by far. And unless we loosen up regulations, encourage more building, do a huge statewide emergency plan to build more housing, I don't believe this issue is actually going to get solved anytime soon.
Yeah, and we'll dig more into the issue of NIMBYism in a moment, but let's continue on sort of defining the problem itself from all these different perspectives, because you all come from different perspectives. Supervisor, you chair the largest board of supervisors in the state of California. You have more constituents than most governors do. Where do you see the biggest challenge for you from a county perspective?
Well, I mean, when I know that in my district it took 25 years for a housing development project to go forward, you know there's a problem. And so I take to heart what Governor Davis said about the fact that we have issues. And in Sacramento, when they can bring in legislation that actually will waive CEQA requirements for the city of LA, which I wholeheartedly endorse, then they've acknowledged the fact that there is a problem and that it is an impediment. And it has to be looked at. I mean, because CEQA was created for a reason, but now you can drive a hole through some of the issues as it relates to the impediments that it's causing for affordable housing. Having said that, the problem up in the Antelope Valley, for example, is not about jobs. Northrop Grumman and Lockheed have about 5,000 jobs available right now. Housing is the barrier for them. They cannot get people to move up to the Antelope Valley, which was once the most affordable place to live in LA County. There's a development that is being proposed up there, which will probably take another 20 years to build because of the challenges and because of the problems and because of the regulations. So I truly do take to heart that we in government at all levels, federal, state, and county, working with our cities, need to look at why these barriers are in place and what can we do to get out of our own way as it relates to this problem.
And Mayor Steinberg, you have a lot of different perspectives coming from the state leadership to running the city of Sacramento. Now you're being tasked by Governor Newsom to be one of his top sort of czars on the issue of homelessness. What is the biggest challenge from your perspective?
Thank you, first of all, Governor Schwarzenegger, for the invitation, and to all of you for being here today. I want to take a different perspective, and some of you have heard me talk about this before, but this is a very important audience. I want to talk about climate change and renewable energy. What, you say? What does that have to do with the topic at hand here? It really doesn't, but allow me to explain for just a moment. When California decided that climate change was an existential crisis, and we decided that we must replace fossil fuel with renewable energy, we did not say to the energy world, please volunteer and do the best you can at a time frame that is convenient for you to substitute out your fossil fuels for renewable energy. Instead, California, over the course of successive governorships, Governor Davis, Governor Schwarzenegger, Kevin De Leon here was a lead author, mandated that we meet real benchmarks and targets to replace fossil fuel with renewable energy. And you know what the mandate did? It changed behavior. It sent a signal, a strong signal by government that this issue matters, and we better change the way we are working and operating. And if you look at our trajectory, we're far from done, but we're actually dramatically increasing our renewable energy standard. Let's talk about homelessness for a minute. We claim that this is a state of emergency, but do we really mean it? I sometimes wonder, because government actions and inaction send a signal. This is an area of public policy where everything we are called upon to do, either as the state, counties, or cities, because we're all in it together, everything we are called upon to do is optional and voluntary. There is no housing production standard. There is no enforceable benchmarks around meeting increasing percentages to get unsheltered homeless people off the streets. Governor Davis suggested that we ought to apply the same CEQA reform to housing for the homeless as we do for sports stadiums. As an author of one of those bills, by the way, I completely agree with you. But the truth of the matter is CEQA reform is one of 15 things we could talk about here today that will change this equation. So is more resources. So is upzoning, whether it's SB 50 or not, in a way that encourages more dense housing around transit stations. But what will drive all of those difficult political discussions? It must be a mandate. It must be a requirement in California that we actually are accountable for when it comes to reducing the unsheltered homeless population. If we don't require what we know is necessary, we're going to continue to do good things along the way. And certainly as Mayor Garcia, there's heroic work going on in our communities. But I don't believe we will drive ourselves towards the outcomes that we want to seek. If it matters, we require it. And we are not requiring any of us to do anything around this issue. And as a result, quickly, the various funding streams are fragmented. It's an alphabet soup. There's no requirement that jurisdictions work across our artificial boundaries to consolidate our resources. And certainly when it comes to the NIMBY issue, there's no requirement that we cite anything. And it takes endless amount of time, as we know, better to cite. We got to not punish the good jurisdictions that are doing the right thing and doing their best to meet the standards. But I'm telling you, when the mayor of Richmond, California says publicly, got to call it out, to Governor Newsom, we don't want your state land that you're offering us for free, because unless you provide us all of the money and take it over and you do it, we don't want your help. That attitude, by the way, is more common than we know in a lot of parts of California. This needs to change.
So, I mean, you're one of the most powerful guys in the state and have been for a long time. So why isn't there a mandate? Why isn't
maybe
there?
I used to be, but I'm.
Why isn't there a mandate?
But
To your point, though, I mean, why isn't that happening? Why isn't there a mandate?
because the state, I will say that the state, it didn't take Holly Mitchell's point a moment ago, successive administrations, successive legislatures have really, if we admit it, have not said this is important enough to require what we know is necessary. We have to acknowledge that. If this were important, just like educating our children is important, it's a mandate. You think that's voluntary? You think cleaning up the dirty water is voluntary? It's mandatory. We are tacitly saying that this isn't important enough to make it a mandate and to drive the change. And I think it's far past time we change the law. Some call it a right to housing. Our task force called it a legally enforceable mandate for all levels of government to meet aggressive benchmarks. Let's take this on. And then all of the strategies underneath that are necessary will have a much better chance of actually happening.
Supervisor, does that sound good to you, or does mandate sound is that a boogie word?
Well, what comes to mind is SB 50, which was a mandate by the state, basically taking away local control for building, which I know I can speak for LA County. Our cities came unglued. How dare the Sacramento tell us how to do our planning and our development and dictate to us. I agree with you. I mean, I think that there are those cities, and I've been fortunate, actually Pasadena that I represent, the homeless count went down last year. But they took an aggressive and bold policy as it relates to emergency shelter, building interim housing, and actually addressing the mental health and the substance abuse issues on the street. But they feel like they've done their fair share and no one around them has. And so now you're getting pushback. And what I tell my communities is it's a lot about education. These people are already in your community. And if left to their own device, they're not good neighbors. But if we provide housing, including mental health, substance abuse, vocational training, they are good neighbors. So I understand the mandate issue, but I think SB 50 showed us that it's not going to be that cut and dry.
Well, and speaking of you want to say something?
I want to respond on the SB 50 because
Is there another mic?
it kind of gets conflated. First of all, I'll stipulate I liked SB 50, but I understood the opposite.
Explain what SB 50 is for some people in the audience that may not know.
SB 50 was a bill by Senator Scott Wiener that would require local jurisdictions to upzone land near transit stations to build more dense housing. And I was for it, but I understand why a lot of local government leaders were against it, because it was prescriptive. It told local government how to do it. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about a mandate. The state's role is to set a standard, an enforceable standard, and then provide the tools and the options to local government as to how to meet it. One jurisdiction might decide that the SB 50 model is the right way. Another might say tiny homes. Another might say advanced and expedited permitting. So SB 50 is not the kind of mandate I'm talking about. I'm talking about setting a standard that we all drive in our various ways to try to reach.
Mayor Garcia, the supervisor brought up the issue of mental health. And one of the things that we see so often when we're out actually reporting on the streets and talking to homeless people is clearly there's different kind of homeless people. There are people that are homeless because they're sleeping in their car, they just lost their job, they can't pay the rent, and they're going to get back to work soon. But then there are so many people that either have serious mental health or drug addiction problems. And when you ask them, why not go to the shelter down the street, they say, I don't want to. And they refuse services. What do you do with those people? How do you help those people? And do you believe there should be a mandate in terms of forcing them to go in for treatment?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's important for people to recognize that the population of people experiencing homelessness is so diverse. And I do believe, and I think that more and more folks, I hear, particularly those that are making policy decisions, that there are people on the street that are so mentally ill that they cannot take care of themselves. And I think that we have, through our court system and through just our policies here and other places, have established a norm that regardless of how mentally ill someone is on the street, that they have a civil right to be out on the street. And I think we have to have a stronger conversation. I believe that there are people that are on the street that are suffering, and that we have a greater responsibility as a society to make a decision about their care. And so that conversation is happening, I think, more and more. I see it in op-eds and on policy discussions, but that's something that I personally support. The key issue here also is people are mentally ill. There are folks that are homeless that are committing crimes, I think, but I always tell people there are also people that are in homes that are committing crimes. And everyone has a right. If someone is mentally ill, it's not about just care for that person. But if you're a mom and you've got a kid, and that kid wants to walk to school, that mom also has a right to be able to send their kid down the street and feel safe that their kid is going to be safe. And so I think that taking good care of someone that is extremely mentally ill is more broad, and it helps a larger public safety picture. So I hope that that's a conversation that the state and the courts will have a little bit more aggressively.
And Senator Mitchell, I know this is an issue that you're passionate about as well. You've looked at from the state perspective. You're now looking at it potentially as a supervisor for the county. What do you do in that situation? Somebody tells you, I don't want help.
And so I think we generalize that notion that there are people who say I don't want to help more broadly than that really is. I'm a member of the Senate Health Committee. I have voted any number of bills. Assemblymember Santiago has had a bill to come before us to really push the envelope in terms of, involuntary holds and removing people forcefully. But I think we really have to ask the question about the kind of facilities we're asking people to go to. I had a mother come before me in Budget Committee that said, to explain to us why she lives on the river in Sacramento during the spring and why she's in her car in the winter. That if you're a family in the settings that are available to her in Sacramento, when your son reaches 14, he can no longer stay with you and the family side of the wing. She was expected to send her 14-year-old son to the single adult male end of the shelter. She wasn't going to do that. And at the time, I'm the mother of a son. At the time, my son was 14 too, and I understood that. I carried the bill to make California a housing first state, that we can't wait for people to clean up their lives, quote unquote, in terms of substance abuse in order to be eligible to qualify for housing assistance. We have to get people housing first. And so I agree, and we're working with the disability rights advocates to say, this is a new day, it's a new time. We are not going to go back in time to a point where we're going to forcibly hold people against their will unless they are living on the streets and they need help. We get that. So we have to work with the disability rights advocates to understand the new conditions in which we live, but we also have to build temporary shelters, permanent supportive housing to meet the needs of the people who need it. To expect a mother to go into a shelter and not keep her family together, shame on us.
And Supervisor, I know this is an issue that you're pretty passionate about, and we've talked about on Fox 11 this issue.
Yeah, so I worked with Assemblymember Santiago on that legislation, which made it, I was told by one of my colleagues that it wouldn't make it out of the Assembly, made it out of the Assembly 75-0, but died in the Senate. And I'm actually grateful it did, because the reality is the Lanham and Petra Short Act has not been looked at for, 51 years? And so I think it is time to do a deep dive in terms of what needs to be updated, if you will. And I'm grateful to Mayor Steinberg for being a leading advocate on having the audit come forward, which is now taking place. But I disagree. I think that a lot of why the mentally ill are still on the street is because of lack of services. And in the county, I've made this my commitment, and we are purchasing 500 mental health beds over the next 2 years, understanding that the state is now going to enter into a waiver with the federal government to allow us to bill Medicaid for these mental health beds. I talked to law enforcement who, if you talk to the first responders, they could write a book on every single homeless person on the street right now, because they come in contact with them, if not daily, at least weekly. And a lot of the reason why these people do not get defined as gravely disabled is because there are a lack of resources. And it's not about institutionalizing, it's about stabilizing and then providing them the support, which may be a board and care, which may be a conservatorship, which we're expanding. In the county, we are expanding the conservatorship. Senator Wiener's bill is something that we are implementing. I think we need to go a little farther with that, but it's a good start. So the goal is not to institutionalize, it's to build community services, stabilize, and for those that are unwilling to come in off the street, take the medication to them on the street. Get them the help they need.
Supervisor, I completely agree with you. Let me just clarify. I completely agree with you. The point is we have to get the disability rights advocates to the table also, because they're afraid of rolling back pre-Lantern Short Act. The last thing I would say is my statement earlier about the slow boil and the role of government. We also failed in terms of the construction of community-based mental health facilities when we closed the state hospitals. So that was another shortcoming of government, to not do and finish the work that we started. We closed the hospitals. People went on the streets, and so what we're seeing now is a couple of generations of a lack of investment in terms of appropriate mental health facilities for the spectrum of mental health services that people need, both residential, for children, all age groups. Government has to step up and make it available.
We do have $2.4 billion a year being generated every year under Prop 63, the Mental Health Services Act. And what's that? I don't know who authored it, but the money's saving lots of lives and doing great things. I'd like to see it even more focused on people with serious mental illnesses who are unsheltered and homeless. Real quick on this LPS issue, it is far past time we look at the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act. However, because it should never be considered a civil right for people to live in squalor on the streets. And yet, and I authored an op-ed in the LA Times where I said, you know what? If there's a right to shelter, there ought to be an obligation for people to come indoors if it's offered. But here's the problem. We have not done our part to consolidate these resources, to spend them more effectively and urgently, and build the capacity that allows us to offer somebody a bed or a home or a roof. And so I don't think we quite have the moral high ground, or the legal high ground, frankly, if you read the Boise case, to compel people to come in until we do our part. Once we do, I think it's reasonable to say in a civil society, people must live indoors and under a roof. There's a middle ground here, and that we have to.
And I'll add to what the mayor said. I think that clearly mental illness is a key issue on this conversation around homelessness, and it's gotten so hard to handle in cities. If you look at, for example, crime, and you're seeing homicides and crime decrease almost everywhere in cities in California. But where you're seeing the uptick and where you're seeing crime increase is in these small aggravated assault cases. And a large portion of these cases, as the mayor knows, are folks that are experiencing homelessness or that are extremely mentally ill. They're not necessarily bad people, but they have not been treated. Their illness has not been treated, and they're causing crimes in every city in California. And so if we don't take a bolder step, as Mayor Steinberg is suggesting, this area of safety will continue to be the top concern for families in all of our cities. And so I think we have to be much more aggressive on the mental illness issue.
And part of that discussion has been about this issue of Prop 47, which I know Dr. Drew came on Good Day LA recently and said that it's been murder. You know, Mayor Garcia has talked about the fact that he doesn't necessarily think it's been helpful for people. Has that hurt? Has that made it helpful or hurt, or has it made it harder or easier for you in terms of solving this issue, which is essentially decriminalizing a lot of drug use?
Well, I mean, to your point, what you just said, I use the term dual diagnosis. They are self-medicating to address their mental illness. And, you know, you can debate whether the drug is what caused the mental illness or the mental illness is what caused them to use drugs. But the bottom line is, I do believe that Prop 47 has exacerbated the situation. And my frustration is, we can build all the housing we want, but at the end of the day, in LA County, we continue to house, but the number continues to grow. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. The cost of housing clearly is probably the largest issue, as we saw that was shown with the study that was done by HUD. But I do believe I have yet to meet an addict that doesn't eventually lose everything. And we are in LA County expanding on the beds for alcohol and drug addiction, but there is no way for us to get them in. And I'm not saying to create it as a felony again, but I think we need to have some teeth in what's going on now, because right now we are enabling a population to use on the street, and I think we have a moral obligation.
Other thoughts? Anybody agree or disagree with
If
that?
I could just comment on Prop 47, while we didn't keep up with building housing or we didn't keep up with building mental health facilities for people, we did a great job as a state in terms of building prisons and jails. And so the whole notion about Prop 47 is people were housed there perhaps inappropriately in the first place. We expanded the building of prisons, and then guess what we did? We filled them up. Perhaps we filled them up with people who were suffering from mental illness and substance abuse, and they didn't get treatment there. So the whole point of the pendulum swinging the other way and our effort to right-size the criminal justice system is to acknowledge that we incarcerated people who were suffering before. So now we have had an awakening with the new drug of choice on the street. We understand that it's a public health issue and people are suffering. Well, that was the case 30 years ago, when we over-incarcerated people who are suffering in the community socioeconomically and used crack and cocaine as a drug of choice. So, the kids in the community have a saying that they say, don't be brand new. So let's not be brand new about how we got here. Prop 47 is our effort to adjust a pendulum that swung too far in one direction.
But do you think that it should be repealed? I mean, do you think it's a good thing?
I do not think it should be repealed. We should build facilities and programs to help people meet their needs, not jail.
Yeah. Do you want to weigh in on that, or we? Can go
Well,
to the
I'm happy
topic?
to. I don't think it should be repealed either, and I think Senator Mitchell's comments are right on. But I do think, if we talk about that pendulum, that it could be adjusted just a little bit to give the courts a hard carrot, if you will, to try to help somebody and induce them to get treatment, not to put people in jail or prison for long periods of time. Whether it's Prop 47 or an obligation to come indoors, that we do need more tools to help people get the treatment that they need.
And I'm going to agree. I don't think Prop 47 should be repealed. I do think, though, that on the adjustment side, one thing that was told, I think, to cities when Prop 47 went through is that there would be this rush of funds, and all of these services would come into cities and counties so that we could help folks when they're coming out of the prison system. You can't expect someone coming out of the prison system that really needs social work, needs mental health care, and might need just some general health care, without and for them to come out of the system, not get any sort of social service support. We can't expect them to all of a sudden get a job the next day and to get on their way and have their life all fixed. And so I think the failure of Prop 47 was not the law itself, but it was our inability to assist people coming out of the system and get them into job training, get them into health care, and get them the services that they needed. And we were not equipped, nor did we receive the funding, I believe, as cities to be able to help manage some of that.
Much like our failings when the state hospital closed, and we weren't ready either.
So let's bring up the other issue you brought up earlier, which is let's go a little bit deeper into NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. Sent those homeless people somewhere else in terms of housing. Affordable housing is a great concept. I just don't want it next to me. How do you solve that? I mean, what's your advice to other lawmakers here? What have you guys learned in terms of how to actually deal with that? Has anybody figured it out?
Go ahead.
No. Well, I mean, I prior to being elected, I was staff, and so I've worked on this issue up in Cagle Canyon, Union Rescue Mission, Andy Bales. Women and children were down on Skid Row, and he said, this is wrong. So he purchased property up in Cagle Canyon, and the community became concerned. Are their boyfriends gonna come up and rob us? I mean, it was a nightmare. But it took months of educating the community about who we're talking about. We're talking about women and children who've never had a stable environment to learn, who are finally gonna be able to get picked up by a bus, go to school, come home, do their homework, have tutors, while their mother gets the help that she needs, and they can move on and actually build a life together. That has been the most successful program, but it took a year of educating the public. NIMBYism is alive and well. Everyone says fix it. I guarantee you, in every community, everyone's saying do something, and then when you say we're going to do it here, they say, wait, we didn't mean here. Do it over there. And at some point, I tell people it's now to the point where it's not about money, Because in LA County, the estimate was $355 million per year from Measure H, and it's now at $420 that we brought in. It's about leadership. And it's about taking that bold step to say, we are going to do it, and we are going to be responsive and responsible. But at the same time, you can no longer say, not in my backyard.
I would say government can't do it alone. You know, I'm proud to be here on this campus today. My mother graduated with a degree in social work from this campus in 1953, and then couldn't rent, as a young social worker working for LA County, couldn't rent an apartment in the jungle where her white classmates could. And so we saw the statistics in terms of the disproportionate number of people of color who are homeless. Senator Murray talked about the civil rights issue of today. You know, NIMBYism isn't just about government. It's about all of us having a collective conversation about what kind of civilized society we want to live in, and when we are going to move beyond fear of people who don't look like you.
I'm just going to, I think we're getting close to running out of time. So I want to go around the horn and give each of you 20, 30 seconds, most important thing to solving homelessness that you want people here to know.
I'm going to start with the NIMBY question, and that'll be my close. So it is incumbent upon all of us to actually show people that when you talk about navigation centers or affordable housing, you're building quality facilities with good services that actually help the neighborhood, because you're getting people off the street instead of injuring the neighbor. That's our responsibility. But it's also true that where communities are completely unwilling to have a reasonable conversation about doing the right thing, the law ought to mandate, once again, that we build what is required to be built. I'm a mayor. I believe in local control, but it is not an absolute. And this crisis is of such a magnitude that we cannot just say because a jurisdiction or a community doesn't want something that is essential to help abate the crisis, that we just say, okay, that's the way that it is. There needs to be some compulsion here to get the job done.
Supervisor, quickly, your thoughts.
So really quickly, for me, I tell people I'm not going to try to boil the ocean, but I'm looking at the root cause, and mental health is where I believe I'm going to be putting a lot of my energy in expanding services and providing the support necessary, even for alcohol and drug. And I completely agree with you. We shouldn't be jailing them. We should be providing them with the resources to get the help they need. But in addition to that, housing. I continue to work in my district to encourage and provide support for people to want to develop, because time is money in the private sector. And in government, we get paid every 2 weeks. In the private sector, if you don't get it done, you don't get paid. So it's going to continue to be an issue, and I look forward to working with my state partners on addressing those barriers and those impediments that are creating this logjam of permitting that is not taking place.
Mayor Garcia.
NIMBYism is a bipartisan challenge, and doesn't matter how liberal your community is or how much how big of a heart your friends are in certain neighborhoods. There is almost universal pushback against building the types of projects and programs that we're talking about. And so I think there has to be statewide intervention when cities don't meet their housing goals, and that I think all of us have that challenge. And when you get a council member in a city that is being screamed and yelled at by their constituents to not build more affordable housing, that is very difficult to overcome when you're a mayor, when you're trying to build more housing. And so I think there has to be, the state's got to come in and on a 5 year basis, put together a package of initiatives, some of which are happening right now in the state of California, to encourage the private sector and the public sector to be able to build housing faster and dealing with CEQA and other challenges as well.
Lastly.
I certainly appreciated hearing the Secretary talk about compassion. I certainly would like to experience some more compassion from the federal government as a state policy maker here in California, and would hope that his message of compassion would trickle up to the president of our fair country. 3 things I would say. We have to stabilize our communities. I have constituents who are homeowners who are scared to death. They are holding on by the skin of their teeth. So we have to stabilize our communities and have frank, honest conversations about how everybody is at risk. I would challenge the poll numbers in terms of who thinks they're at risk. You know, sometimes people don't tell the pollsters the truth. I think that far more people are afraid of entering homelessness. We have to stabilize our communities and create products to help people stay where they are. We have to scale up for LA County. The models that we've heard about that are working, we've got to amplify them, because I believe there are more than 60,000 unhoused people on the street when I consider the number of unhoused community college students and the number of CalWorks families who apply for CalWorks with no permanent address. And we have to build for all across the spectrum. The housing crisis is impacting everyone, and everyone is getting squeezed. And so how we figure out how to move beyond NIMBYism and build for the future generation across the socioeconomic spectrum so everybody can call Los Angeles home again.
Exactly. And last there you go. I guess you got one vote here today. And lastly, Mayor Steinberg, we heard about your dinner with Governor Schwarzenegger, and he served you vegan food. How was his vegan food?
The best vegan food I've ever had.
Of
and
course.
the company was great, too. Thank you.
Well, we thanks to him, and I've learned a lot of things from Governor Schwarzenegger, who's not only one of the great bodybuilders of all time, one of the great actors, one of the great politicians. He's also one of the great self-promoters. So I would have to take a moment to let you know I host a show called The Issue Is. It's California's only statewide political show. We talk about issues like this every week. This week's show is all about this issue and all about this conference. So we air every Friday at 10:30. Many people here have been on it. And we hope you'll check it out. But thank you, Governor Schwarzenegger, for making this happen. I think it's extraordinary that you use your platform and your star power to bring people together and to talk about what is one of the most important issues of our time, and we appreciate bringing various perspectives together. Thank you all for sharing your views and making time to talk about this today, and thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.